Thank you so much, Julia, for coming, and over to you.
Thank you, Claire. And welcome and good morning or good afternoon or very early morning, depending on where you're joining us from. So thank you very much to Claire for that introduction. So, interestingly, my slides won't move forward. There we go. Perfect. So I think Claire already covered most of this. So I'm an executive coach and a psychologist. I work in the legal sector. So I started out as a lawyer and then moved over to the learning and development and coaching area. So why did I choose this topic? So in brief, back in the 2000s, I studied psychotherapy. I don't practice, but it informs my coaching. So that was kind of early days. And then in 2018, I had the opportunity to do a week-long session with somebody called Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote the book The Body Keeps the Score, which is, I'll come on to in a little bit, has been a real bestseller in the area of trauma. So that is really where my interest in trauma comes from, is about 2018. And then more recently, I had a coaching client who, during an otherwise pretty normal session, disclosed a very serious historic trauma that had happened in their life. They brought it up because it was relevant to the topic of the coaching, and I acknowledged it. And while we didn't revisit the trauma, because they'd processed it in therapy, it did inform the coaching. Afterwards, when I was in supervision, I was reflecting on whether I'd overstepped a boundary, even though I didn't feel like I had. And I also wondered if I would have found the moment as more difficult if I hadn't had that prior experience with the psychotherapy and already having some familiarity with trauma. So fast forward, I was doing a master's in coaching psychology, and I had to choose a topic for my research. And the advice they give you is pick a topic that you're passionate enough about that you're not going to get frustrated and bored because it's going to take ages. And so I thought, well, I've always been interested in trauma, so I'm going to choose that for my topic. And so in this session, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you about my research, and then I'm going to talk to you about some of the practical suggestions that the people I interviewed for my research shared. And I will allow plenty of time for questions at the end. So as you may know, the topic of trauma in the context of coaching is a relatively new field with very little academic research, except in the context of post-traumatic growth. So the idea that out of trauma can come growth. And I've included references in slides at the end if you want to look at any of this in more detail. So I did for those of you who know about research, I did a qualitative study to address what I saw as a gap between how coaches and supervisors were actually working and what little was known about that on the academic side. I decided to interview supervisors, coach supervisors, actually for a really practical reason, which was that I could interview a smaller number of supervisors and still reach or still hear about a large number of sessions. But actually it had a really positive benefit for me in that I was able to learn a lot about supervision and become really interested in that too. So to explain my research, I collected data through 15 semi-structured interviews with supervisors. And then I analysed the data, and this is the last bit of the sort of research language, through something called reflective thematic analysis. And I identified through that process 3 themes. So the first was that the trauma content in coaching supervision is as much about the trauma biography of the coach as the coachee. That coaches and supervisors are working in the presence of trauma, not coaching the trauma itself, and that supervisors address the fear that some coaches expressed around the topic, and that some supervisors felt themselves sometimes, by really focusing on the fundamentals of coaching that you'll have learnt about as part of your training or that you'll be learning about now. The terminology I'm going to try and stick to through this is coachee for the client, the end client, coach, and supervisor. The words in italics represent here the words used by participants. So in the presence of trauma was an expression used by the participants, and the fundamentals of coaching was something also that came from the interviews. I should mention that trauma biography was wording used by the participants, but it's also language from a practitioner text that's probably the main practitioner text in this area, which is Julia Vaughan-Smith's book called Coaching and Trauma. So that's 2019, Julia Vaughan-Smith. And that's a very good practitioner text in this area. And she credits the phrase to a therapist called Franz Rupert. But again, I've included references for this at the end if you want to find out more. So I said that this is a fairly new area in coaching. And the question is, why now? Why is this topic becoming a big topic in coaching? And as we all know, coaching doesn't take place in a vacuum. The people who come to coaching, the people who coach them, the people who supervise them, we're all living in the world and experiencing what has been a very tumultuous period. Alongside that, trauma-informed practice has also become a hot topic in fields aligned with coaching. For other sort of health areas, policing, criminal justice, various other areas. So there's also a lot of work on various governments to consider what is trauma-informed practice. So you've got kind of the big picture, the wider world, you've got government policy. Alongside that, there is just a greater awareness amongst the general public around and use of the word trauma in the media, etc. So I mentioned Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score. That was on the US New York Times bestseller list for years during the pandemic. And the Harvard Business Review had an article in 2022 on trauma-informed workplaces. And then here in the UK in 2023, the book of the year, the business book of the year, was a book called Leader as Healer. So it's really entering the mainstream, this idea of trauma and trauma in the workplace. Trauma has also, as I say, become an area of interest in coaching with books like Julia Vaughan-Smith's, but also last year the ICF ran a series around trauma-informed coaching. Many of the supervisors that I spoke to said that they thought that this was an area where they would only be more interested in this topic over time. Even those who didn't think trauma came up that much now did think it would increasingly be coming up in the future. And that's partly because of this greater awareness just more broadly in the world. So to go back to my research and to consider the first theme, all supervisors that I interviewed gave examples of when trauma had shown up in their supervision sessions. And I grouped the examples into two main buckets. One was where the trauma that they talked about came from the coachee, so something that had happened in relation to the coachee. And then the second bucket was where it was something that had occurred for the coach, so that was going on for the coach themselves. And then there was one other, instead of making it a nice clean 10, it's 11, because there was an additional one about how it sometimes came up for the supervisor. But my biggest takeaway, the thing I was most surprised by, was the way in which the examples were as much about the coach as the coachee. So that to me was quite a surprise. I had envisaged it being mostly about things that were coming up just for the coachee. So to look at where the trauma was coming up for the coachee, so you had in scenario A, the sort of situations where trauma was inherent in the coachee's setting. So the example there would be something like working, so a coach was working in a setting, working for a charity that supported people with cancer. So obviously part of what was going on around that person, that they were experiencing trauma. It was something to do with the setting. B was where a current trauma came up during the coaching, but wasn't the topic of the coaching. So an example there was where a coach was working with someone, and this was an internal coach, was working with someone whose child was self-harming. That was obviously very traumatic for the coachee, but it wasn't the topic of the coaching, which was around a work situation. C was where the coachee disclosed a historic trauma. Again, not the topic of the coaching. So the example there was where a coachee divulged that as a younger person, they had experienced rape. And so it came up in the context of them talking about something work related, and they chose to share this also with the coach. The fourth scenario was where a coachee actually had a trauma episode during the coaching. Now, that seemed to be very rare in terms of what the supervisors were saying, but it does encourage us to really get to a place where we understand that anything can happen in a coaching session. And as we'll talk about later, it's really about focusing on the fundamentals of coaching so that you're going to be able to handle that if it does. And then the fourth scenario was where there wasn't a specific trauma that the coachee brought up, but that some of the ways in which they behaved maybe suggested that there might have been some traumatic experience, maybe some developmental trauma in their past. So that's the phrase survival behaviors is used a lot in books like Julia Vaughan Smith's book. And again, I've included references at the end. But survival behaviors, the idea is that it's a way that a behavior somebody adopted to help them survive an earlier challenge in their life, but that maybe is no longer serving them. So, for example, rescuing others, for example, sometimes having a lack of empathy or burnout, various things that these survival behaviors might indicate that there was some earlier challenge. So that's what coaches sometimes see with coachees. And then this is what supervisors sometimes see with coaches. So the first was where a coach had a niche in terms of their practice area that was related to a trauma that they had experienced and wanting to help others who might have experienced that trauma. The supervisor who talked about that said actually that they'd been quite concerned about the coach who had chosen that niche, and actually in the end they chose to change their niche because it was bringing up too many issues for them in relation to their own experience. So this was just was again a very narrow, only one example of that. The second was where a coach disclosed a current trauma in supervision, and a common one that came up was around bereavement. So again, as coaches, we're all humans living in the world, experiencing all the things, that our coachees might be experiencing, and that could include something like a bereavement. What was different here was that actually sometimes someone had come to supervision specifically because something had happened in their lives and they wanted help with their practice through that process. So an example was someone who'd had a stroke who was then seeking special supervision to try and help them work out what they should do in relation to their coaching practice going forward. The next category, and I'll get through these categories soon, I just want to really give you the background here for what we'll then talk about in terms of the tips. The third was where third in this section was where a coach had disclosed to the supervisor something about their past, a trauma that they had experienced that was relevant for their work as a coach. So an example that was given a couple of times was where a female coach had a history of relational trauma, which sometimes caused problems for them when it came to working with certain male coachees. And so that was relevant to bring to supervision so that they could unearth what was going on for them there and be more able to work with their coachee. A very small group was where it was just one, supervisor talked about where somebody actually, a coach, actually had a trauma episode during the supervision. So again, really very unlikely. This is many, 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 many coaching sessions that all these supervisors have had, and supervision sessions. There was one example, and actually the supervisor was able to handle it, contain it, and the coach was fine. But again, just underlines that these things can happen, and it's about how we really dig down into those fundamentals, and really look after the setting and that person if something like that were to happen. And then the last category is where sometimes actually coaches themselves could show survival behaviors. So sometimes there's that client that coachee that just seems to press the buttons for you, or you seem to be particularly harsh on them or particularly rescuing of them. And there's something there about actually, what is this bringing up in your background that maybe is to do with experiences you've had in your life, that might be impacting how you're working with that person. So something to consider. A really common one there was actually where a coachee brought up a trauma, the coach feeling like they weren't possibly good enough to cope in that moment, and actually recognizing that that might be a survival behavior, and actually, to really focus again on what you know, your skills, lean into your supervision, rather than sitting with that feeling. And then the last, so I'll move here. So here is an example that one of the supervisors said. So if a coach is saying, I'm really finding this client difficult, I don't know what's going on, I find it really challenging. What the supervisor in this instance said was, okay, so let's see what's going on here, what's really happening. So we're looking at who that client has become for the coach in terms of usually the there and then and now and the here and now. So old stuff that's causing them to either distance or feel they have to rescue, or feel that they're not being good enough or a good enough coach, and what that's about. So again, as I'm sure you've been learning, really just tapping into, what does this mean for, what am I feeling and what's that about, when I'm working with this coachee. And here again, another supervisor participant, the issues the client brings, which seem stubbornly resistant to changing, are very likely to be explained by assumptions, attitudes, beliefs, behaviors that were formed as protective mechanisms in our early lives. So again, it's not about going back and digging into why those survival behaviors exist, but observing that that might be what's going on and holding it very lightly. I think Claire and I were talking about this just before everyone came on. All of this, we're holding it all very, very lightly, but just noticing, is it slightly out of proportion in terms of someone's current reaction to something? And if that's the case, maybe it's actually about something in the past. Also, another one to watch out for here, depending on the kind of work you do, but I think it's a really interesting one, is the risk of collusion. So you put a coach and a coachee who are both in survival mode together. The CEO who is just trying to be worthy, pushing themselves forward to the point of burnout, and a coach who really, really wants to prove themselves and wants to absolutely, help this person get, all their goals achieved. And actually the danger there of them both sort of the survival behaviors kind of driving each person on. So again, just being aware of your own contribution, as well as that of the coachee. And then finally, just for completeness, the other thing that we saw, which was really interesting, and again, is just a reminder that we are all human and we're all having these experiences, is that there were scenarios where the coachee, the coach, and the supervisor were all actually having similar life challenges. And so sometimes that, from the supervisor's perspective, was really interesting in terms of working with the coach in supervision. So a really interesting example was where a coach was working with a coachee, and the coachee was experiencing workplace bullying. But the coach was actually quite short-tempered with the coach, was a bit unsympathetic with the coachee. Short-tempered is probably too strong a word, but was a bit unsympathetic with the coachee. And this brought out quite strong feelings in the supervisor because they had experienced workplace bullying earlier in their life. And so it was very interesting to think about, well, what was making the coach in the middle withdraw? And that might be their own experiences. And then how did the supervisor handle it? Because it also brought up some challenges for them. And in that instance, again, the supervisor, being experienced, leant back into what they knew about coaching and encouraged the coach to really look at the big picture, to look at the system that the coachee was in. And that helped the coach to engage more effectively with the coachee. But as you'd imagine, not many other things came up in the context of the supervisor, because actually a supervisor should have their own supervisor. And so things like this would come up with their own supervisor rather than in supervision sessions. So that's the first theme. The second theme is much shorter, so we'll get through this one quite quickly. And that is this idea that we're working in the presence of trauma, not with the trauma itself. And there was a contrast between those people I interviewed who thought trauma came up frequently and those who thought it was rare. And initially that was a bit puzzling for me, but when I actually dug into the data, the difference actually seemed to be more about how they thought about it. So how common they thought trauma was in everyday life, whether they'd studied trauma, and whether or not they understood showing up to mean that trauma was present or to mean that trauma was the topic of the coaching. Those who said it came up frequently didn't think showing up meant that trauma was the topic. They were also more likely to have studied trauma, and they were also more likely to have had experiences that meant they thought that trauma was more part of everyday life. Those who thought it was rare said that the word didn't come up frequently and they were hesitant to use it themselves, whereas those who thought it did come up more often were more comfortable with the word, but again agreed that it wasn't something you would be using in a coaching session, but it was more something that might come up, that you might talk about in that way in supervision. The supervisors agreed that the coaches were not actually meeting the trauma itself very often, and that, quote, they shouldn't be working directly on the trauma or seeking to explore the source of the trauma itself when it does come up. So that's that point from before. You can hold lightly this awareness that somebody might be exhibiting a survival behavior. It's not the role of the coach to work out what led to that survival behavior. So although some of the scenarios I gave you did talk about somebody, for example, having a trauma episode in a session, those were actually real outliers, and far less common than the scenarios where trauma was just present but not the topic of the coaching. Okay, that was just the point I'm going to make there, so I'm going to skip along quickly to this one. But several supervisors spoke about how they tried to balance being open to trauma while at the same time not seeking it out. So giving the client, the coachee, a sense that they would listen to whatever the coachee needed, was bringing, but not looking for it. So not sort of wondering whether it was there. And if they suspected a survival behavior, they would just note it. And as I said before, just hold it lightly. Wouldn't necessarily raise it unless it related to the topic of the coaching, if they had permission to do so. So it seemed more likely that something that they would observe and maybe raise in supervision for discussion. So the third theme is this idea that the topic of trauma can sometimes bring up fear in people. And the word fear came up quite a lot when I was interviewing the supervisors, and in a variety of ways. So several supervisors talked about coaches being fearful of continuing to work with a coachee who had raised trauma content. So as one supervisor put it, I've had many supervisees say, oh, I can't do this. I think they need to have a therapist. It's not suitable for coaching. You can hear in the voice. So, okay, let's backtrack. Let's just steady ourselves and see what's going on. Because often coaching can offer quite a lot that isn't stepping over a boundary, but what's getting in the way is the coach's anxieties. So you're not going to be coaching the trauma, but if something comes up that is trauma related, just taking a step back and making sure you're not reacting to that content, but really steadying yourself, as this person describes, and think about what's going on. And then fear of feelings. So I think particularly if you're early in your coaching journey, it's really understandable that there's an anxiety sometimes around, well, what do I do if my coachee cries, or if my coachee is very emotional? And that's, if you've ever felt that, or if that's something you're worrying about as you're listening to me, know that you are not alone. It is a very, very common feeling that people have. And that's why it's so important to be considering topics like this and getting comfortable so that you can handle feelings when they come up. So several supervisors said, I'm often on the alert for reassuring coaches that it's okay to stay with feelings. It's like feelings are part of who we are. Don't frighten yourself around really letting the client express their feelings or talk about something that was traumatic in early life. In coaching, you will at some stage bring it back to the here and now, the current context or the challenge at work or whatever, in order to coach around that, but don't shut somebody off. So just be knowing that you have the skills to bring this back to coaching, or if it becomes necessary for coaching to be discontinued or for a referral, that you can handle that too within the contract. Move forward, and you should feel comforted by the fact it's not just you. Even amazing supervisors, the topic of trauma, it's difficult. We're human beings. We don't like to think of other people in distress or of having had difficult situations, but knowing that even supervisors sometimes think, gosh, this is a difficult thing that someone's shared with me, but it's also a privilege that they've shared it with you. So it's just about thinking, what as a coach do I know? What are my core skills, my contracting, my listening, that are going to help me in this situation? And really just being careful to treat the other person well in that situation and not make them feel rejected. It may be that they need help from a therapist or some other resource, and that might mean referral, but just being careful not to out of a place of panic or fear to sort of push that person away and make them feel other. I think that is really, really important. And so again, really great that you're here in this session. So hopefully you'll feel a little more empowered if that situation were to occur, so that you can handle it sensitively with that person. Because the thing is, it's not just about, some people over there who've had trauma experiences. It's something that does, come up for all of us. And if there's really one takeaway from today, it would be for me to demystify and to think that this is a part of human experience. And so it will come up in your coaching spaces, and just thinking about how you can really lean in to those coaching skills, and be sensitive to what's going on for other people, and that might at some point be going on for you as the coach. If you acknowledge that it's likely to come up at some point, you're more likely to be prepared when it does. So a really key thing that you can do is to think about your own trauma biography. And that might be alongside a therapist, it might be with your supervisor. But again, we're less likely to be sort of caught off guard if we've done a little bit of work around what might be our own issues here. So there's this idea of small t and large t, or big T and little t in some of the literature. And this is this idea that, big T is sort of acute trauma events. And then little t is more potentially lower significant events, or an accumulation of lesser events. And we might all have, a mixture of the two, or maybe small t, but if you've been in the world for a number of years, the chances are that you'll have faced certainly challenges that can help you to know yourself better, but also help you to be more empathetic and more aware if it comes up in your sessions. I've just talked about that. So, the best approach really is to do some of your own personal work. So you're not referring somebody because of your own fear, because of what it's bringing up for you, and that you're really focused on the experience for the coachee. And the good news is we have the tools. As a coach, we really have some core fundamental skills that if you go back to those are really going to help you. So whether that's listening, whether it's the contracting that's so important, whether it's leaning into supervision, there is a framework here that we have as coaches that is going to help us if we focus on those fundamentals. It was actually very interesting. Of the people I interviewed, a lot of them teach coaching, teach supervision, and even those who teach trauma-specific aspects of coaching agreed that what was most important was really getting good at the fundamentals. And trauma, especially specialist trauma-informed training, might be useful, but that really wasn't where you should start. You should really focus on being a great coach with the really core skills, and that particularly for newer coaches was more important to focus on that than more niche trainings. I thought that was very interesting. So this is an English government department, but they came up with this definition of what trauma-informed practice might look like. And this isn't specific to coaching, this was in another area, but I thought it was a really helpful guide and way for me to think about some of the tips that I'm now going to share that came from the supervisors. So the first was, take a trauma lens. So recognize that people may have experienced trauma, which has impacted how they feel, think, and behave. So that first is the awareness piece. The second is do what you can to prevent further re-traumatization. So that's that point about not rejecting the person, making them feel other, but actually how you sensitively deal with whether or not coaching is right for them. Ensuring safety. Now that's something that very important in coaching around contracting, and how you set up the coaching. Take a strengths-based approach. I mean, that's right up our alley as coaches, very much in our sweet spot. And then the importance of building trust. So all of these things fit really well into coaching, and I've taken these bullets and I've adapted them, as I say, to explain some of the things that the supervisors shared with me. And this is how I've sort of translated it into these subheadings. So having a trauma lens, focusing on the fundamentals, even more about contracting and safety, and then about resourcing yourself. So it's really important to also be thinking about your own experience. So on the trauma lens, this was a great quote from one of the supervisors. Trauma informed is that we have an adequate understanding of what trauma is and how it presents. I say adequate. We're coaches, we're not therapists. We're not working with the trauma. We're working in the presence of trauma. So hopefully that's reassuring. There was a real mix within the people I interviewed around whether or not we needed a definition of trauma. So this is the point of view of one of the supervisors. It's very much about the individual's lived experience of the situation or the event or the ongoing pattern in their lives, which can, in my view, be very different. And that's why you find it always very difficult to put a label on things from actually one session to the next, let alone one person to the next. So for this supervisor, it wasn't that important to have a definition, but to have an awareness. For those people that love a definition, and I'm sure some of you are on this Zoom, I have included this one from a government department here in the UK, because I think it's a good description. So trauma results from an event or series of events or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as harmful or life-threatening. While unique to the individual, generally the experience of trauma can cause lasting adverse effects, limiting the ability to function and achieve mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So it's a really broad definition, but you might find that helpful when you're thinking about your own trauma lens. But really, it's about the coachee's lived experience. It's not about diagnosis. It's not about telling someone they've experienced trauma or even using the word, but it's about just having this awareness yourself. So ways that you can do that, as I say, raise your own trauma awareness, take opportunities to learn about what might come up and identify possible survival behaviours. So a really good way of doing that is actually just spending time with other coaches, maybe in group supervision, hearing about the sorts of things that can come up in sessions so that you have an awareness of that. As I mentioned, consider your own trauma biography. What are you bringing to this? What actually has happened in your life that might impact how you responded in a certain situation? Avoid labels. Again, say not using the word trauma if the coachee doesn't bring it up, and being careful not to focus entirely on something that's happened to someone as being the defining characteristic for them. Then there's a lot of other things that will make up that person, and if they bring something up, you don't need to bring it up again. So if the example given about the woman who brought up that she had been raped many years before, what the supervisor said was the coach didn't revisit that in another session because they knew that the coachee had processed this a long time ago. They were bringing it up because it was relevant for the coaching. That wasn't the topic of the coaching, and so it wasn't for the coach to bring it up again and check in a future session on that to revisit that topic. It was to let the coachee lead the way on that. Again, avoiding assumptions around context. So just because someone's successful doesn't mean that they haven't experienced trauma. I know this is maybe obvious, but sometimes it can get a bit lost. Just because somebody's haven't had a bereavement doesn't necessarily mean that's been traumatic for them. Another example, in some places, coming out might be more traumatic than in others, or in certain families or in certain situations. So just being sensitive to not making assumptions. And as I also said, if it's necessary to refer or to discontinue the coaching because it's really not appropriate for coaching, being really careful not to make the person feel othered or somehow broken because coaching is not the right. It could be you're not the right person for them. It could be that coaching's not right for them. All of that is part of the contract that you would be thinking about with that person, but making sure to handle it sensitively. Okay, so we're getting near the end now. So thank you all for sticking with me here. Fundamentals, those core coaching skills, which are just so important. Listening, noticing, paying attention, being present and holding the space, expecting the unexpected. Just because someone's brought a particular coaching topic doesn't mean something unexpected isn't going to suddenly pop up because it's relevant for the topic that they're discussing. Quick point about being present and holding the space. It can sometimes be difficult to pick up on some of these things on Zoom. So really just honing in on what can I see, what sort of, and checking in, checking in with the person on how they're feeling or what certain behaviors or things you're seeing on the screen might mean, and checking them out. I would say all of the supervisors talked about contracting many, many, many times. And I think the longer that you're doing coaching, the more important you realize contracting is absolutely fundamental. It's the wrapper that all of this sits within. And that's really such an important part of how you will do the right thing with someone who brings trauma content, and that you'll look after both yourself and them. So really, really the importance of contracting, so much so we'll come back to it separately in a second. If it's been a difficult session, clearing the space, making sure you've got a little bit of bandwidth either side of a session. You're not just going from one session to another. And as I mentioned, again, reflecting on your own reactions, your own feelings about this. So as I promised, a little bit more detail on contracting and safety. So as I said, if you're on Zoom, it can be a little more difficult than if you're in person. Think about what kind of contact information you might need. So one of the supervisors made a really good distinction that I want to share because I thought it was great, which was you might ask for contact details of the person that you're coaching, and they might be in another country. But in fact, there might be two kinds of contact information you might want if there was a problem. One might be, and the example they gave was, what if a book fell off this shelf and hit me on the head? And you're watching, you're coaching me, and what would you do in that situation? So they were thinking, well, what would be contact information that I would contact if I had a concern for your welfare, kind of in the moment? And then you might also want to think about, well, who would I contact if it was something that maybe wasn't an in the moment concern? So think about who you're working with, where you're working with them, and what sort of contact information would make sense. So another example a supervisor shared was where they were working in a pro bono capacity. And again, sometimes you might have more vulnerable coachees in that situation. And the relationship in terms of contact information wasn't directly between the coach and the coachee. There was the voluntary organization who had the contact information, but couldn't be reached because it was out of office hours. And the coach was concerned about the coachee. So just thinking about that, if there's anyone you're coaching where you don't actually have access to that contact information, could you get it easily if you needed to? Now, again, we're thinking about these things. It's not going to happen. It's about making sure you're prepared if it does. It's not a regular occurrence, but just really thinking through what sort of information would I need if I had any concerns. Having a process to take care of your clients if you become unable to coach for any reason. So think about making sure you have a supervisor, that it would be possible to contact your coachees if you were to have some sort of issue. Again, we are human beings living in the world. Things can happen to us as well, and it's necessary to be thinking about what would happen for our coachees if that were to be the case. Think about contract duration, frequency of sessions. In addition to not having therapeutic training in most coaches, one of the reasons why coaching isn't really a space for trauma to be worked on is that we're not seeing our clients as frequently maybe or over as long a period as a therapist. So that's also partly what you're thinking about here. Think about your workload. So if you are going through a difficult time yourself, or you have ended up with some coachees, the group of coachees you're working with are going through some quite heavy stuff, think about what that means for your own workload and whether you need to be stepping back a little bit or cutting that down a little bit. So think about what you can do to make it safe for yourself and for your coachees. So as I say, it's not just about your training and experience. It might also be that something that you could have coped with 6 months ago, because of personal circumstances, you need to look after yourself at the moment. So thinking about talking to your supervisor about that. And if you start using the phrase trauma-informed, which I would caution you probably not to do, but when people start talking about trauma-informed coaching or trauma-informed practice, just thinking about what you mean by that. And I think Claire and I were talking about this before, and not giving the impression that trauma-informed coaching is about coaching trauma, but it's more about coaching in a way that is putting in these extra safeguards in case trauma content comes up. And I think I need to also just acknowledge it can sometimes be difficult to refer people. If they do need more therapeutic support, there may not be the resource available for that. And that can be a real challenge for the coach in terms of feelings of responsibility around that. So again, something to talk to a supervisor about. Resourcing for yourself is so important. Look at the groups that you can be a part of. So you might have individual supervision, group supervision. Group supervision is really useful, or in groups of mentoring or peer support, in hearing what others are experiencing, and also to get some support for yourself. So really think about how you're resourcing yourself, think about what's available in your organization, what you can opt into, what might be online, what might be in person. The basic sort of things of resourcing ourselves, think about your breath, think about grounding yourself before a session, think about grounding yourself after a difficult session. So what are you doing to look after yourself? And if necessary, stepping away from coaching for a little while. If you've had a particularly challenging experience, you can return to it. You've got those skills. And I think in your training and in your supervision, not being afraid to be vulnerable and open yourself about what you've experienced, so that everyone can learn from that, and really as part of that work on yourself. Again, depending on the setting, it might be more appropriate. It might mean you need to do work yourself, maybe with a therapist or whatever. But just thinking about actually what could I usefully bring to this group where others would benefit from what I'm sharing. A couple of things that came up a lot were the importance for some people around getting out into nature. There are lots of studies around the way that can help us regulate ourselves. And really, if you're spending a lot of time on Zoom, trying to get outside, get some fresh air, some light, see nature, that can be very helpful. And I was very surprised by this one, but several supervisors talked about the importance of humour. Again, in sort of lifting the mood a little bit, be it in your supervision group or whatever, and making sure you have that play, that humour, as part of your, not necessarily in your coaching session so much as to help you and resource you outside of that. I wanted to share this because I actually think it's a really positive example that one of the supervisors gave. And it starts off a little bit sad in the sense that this supervisor had a coach who was really in a difficult place, and she felt that she wasn't a good coach and she wanted to give up coaching. But actually, and had a particularly difficult time. She'd had a few different coachees who, just the way that life sometimes is, they'd each had quite serious things happen in their lives that weren't related to the coaching, but obviously were coming into the coaching. And she was feeling quite overwhelmed by that and finding it difficult to cope. And what actually the supervisor did was help her to realize that what she just needed was a bit of self-care and a bit of space from it. And she stepped away for a little while. She paused her coaching practice. She made sure that her coachees had support from other coaches, continued in supervision, and was then able to return to practice. So, she got better at controlling her own emotional responses and regulating herself, and actually became even more appreciative of the skills, those fundamentals of coaching. So not a common occurrence, but it is just worth remembering that stepping back, maybe not taking on as many clients in a particular month if something's going on for you, and really focusing on those fundamental skills, knowing that you can be back there coaching when you're feeling more resourced. I hope that is a hopeful message. There was a perception, as I said, among the supervisors that trauma content is more likely to come up with this greater awareness in society. So I've got two last takeaways for you. I think the first one is, let's just try and get comfortable with the fact that this is part of the human experience. So if it's part of the human experience, the chances are it might come up in your coaching session. Really important, if it's likely to come up at some time, to be thinking about how you'll handle it if it does. And so much of that is actually just about looking after yourself, and it's about focusing on those fundamentals of coaching. It's not about having lots of additional skills. It's about doing the skills of coaching themselves, and making sure that you're getting the support that you need and that you're plugged into networks like this, and that you have appropriate support. So that's it from me. I really appreciate everybody's attention and joining me for this session. If you'd like to continue the conversation, there's a QR code for my LinkedIn account. But for now, I'm really interested in any questions, thoughts, observations that anyone had. I'm definitely not an expert in this area. It's an area I've researched, I spent a lot of time on, but it's also an area, and one of the things that struck me was all the supervisors that I interviewed were very humble. You know, they'd done many, many years of supervision and coaching, and yet, you know, this is still an area where we're all learning together, and there's so much that we can share to help each other. So please do jump in if you have any questions or thoughts. Back over to you, Claire.
Well, thank you so much. When you were wrapping up, I looked at the time and I'm thinking, gosh, where has that gone? Such a deep, fabulous, and supportive presentation. The three takeaways for me are the contracting. It's okay somehow, you know, this is what happens and it comes up, and also the supervision. So should we close the screen and then we'll see if anyone has any questions?
There we go.
If you have a question, put your hand up or shout out.
I'm just having a look. So I think Magdalena says about curiosity brought her. It is being discussed more openly, and she consciously chose to be better informed. I think that's, you know, with all of these areas, I feel that for me, that I feel that around things like ADHD, it's something I'm not as familiar with, and I'm just trying to make sure that I'm learning in that area as well.
Yeah.
Question.
And then from Fiona there, we've got, how
Yeah.
should it be handled if the trauma experience causes the coachee to become not coachable?
Yeah, so I think what you're saying there, the next bit is, should the coach refer them to a therapist or psychologist, or should the coach first help with a trauma-informed coaching approach? So if there's a trauma experience that is causing you as the coach to think that coaching is not the way forward, there's a couple of things I'd say here. The first is a trauma-informed approach is not coaching the trauma. So what would make it trauma-informed would be you recognizing that this might not actually be suitable for coaching, recognizing that there's something going on here, and having that conversation with the coachee, because this is coaching, you know, finding out what other resources they have, and rather than, I think the referral is always a tricky one, because it's not, you know, you're not prescribing, you know, we're not therapists ourselves, but it's about talking to someone about whether coaching is suitable for this, and whether actually they need to access other support. It's certainly a good idea to be aware of other support that might be available for someone. Again, can be quite a good thing to ask early. You know, when you're first contracting with someone, I actually have a question in my contract around, you know, if you're already seeing a therapist, maybe discuss with your therapist whether or not to tell me about that. Because it might be useful for me to know that you also have a therapist in your life, but it's very much up to you whether or not you tell me. So I think thinking about trauma informed is not about having a go at coaching the issue. It's actually thinking, if I've got an awareness that there might be some trauma going on here, is coaching the right way forward? But to make sure you're stepping back and thinking, am I just suggesting that because I'm a bit anxious because of the topic, or the topic's created some fear in me, and actually we can carry on coaching on the work topic the person brought, and this is sort of in the presence of, but not coaching on that topic? Or is actually the person really in need of some other sort of help, and having that conversation with them, coach to coachee, would be my advice there. I don't know if that helps, or if you have anything additional to add, Claire, with your years of supervisor experience.
I think that's absolutely fabulous. I'm also thinking the thing of, when we remember we're coaching the person right now in terms of their goals for the future and also that journey towards it. And I always have in my mind something I took to supervision where this particular topic kept coming up. It was almost like walking around the swimming pool and not jumping in. And it was bringing in a lot from the past. And then working with my supervisor, I did then share, this was some years back, I did then share with the person I was coaching, it may be that some therapy around this is required, and we can still carry on coaching on this. So I think the other myth is some people think it has to be therapy or coaching, whereas you can have the two together as long as the contracting is really clear.
Yes. I mean, I want to be aware that we're not all in the same location, but I think one thing that I see in the UK is an increased comfort level, particularly amongst younger generations around therapy. And that,
Yes.
you know, a number of people now, you know, you come across have had therapy and are quite comfortable talking about it. I mean, as I say, I actually include in my contract now this line about, you know, if you are working with a therapist, discuss with them whether or not you're going to let me know, so that I know that's also going on. But yes, I think historically there was always an argument that sometimes people came to coaching because they didn't want to go to therapy. But I think there's more of an understanding now that yes, you could be working with a coach and a therapist. You could have maybe worked with a therapist before and now be working with a coach. And that might be a scenario where someone tells you about a prior trauma because they've worked through it in therapy and they have got the self-awareness to realize that it might be something that's relevant for whatever it is that's occurring for them around the coaching topic, and they're not needing you to do anything with that other than just know that that could be part of the picture. Yeah.
And
I
then
think
Nadia,
yeah,
sorry,
um,
Julia.
I definitely don't have a training that I would say absolutely do that. My slides, which I think Claire will probably share, do have a lot of book recommendations at the end. I also there are some trainings coming online. You know, there are some trainings coming online. I'm definitely more of the school of thought that I think what we need is trauma-informed training rather than training on being trauma-informed. Sort of these that, you know, really just doubling down on the importance of contracting, etc. But there are trainings. And as I say, Julia Vaughan Smith's book, she does some trainings and she's very experienced. But I think the ICF I would imagine the recordings are available from those from last year. So they did a series last year. So that's another place that you could go. And then just keeping an eye out on LinkedIn, there are several people on there who are doing some interesting work in this area. But that's really partly why I chose it for my research, was that there isn't very much really evidence-based, really sort of deep practitioner experience in this area. And so it is an evolving area. So also being a bit careful, because I think there are some people who are using trauma-informed coaching to really mean more coaching the trauma, which I would argue is not really what that's about. So being a bit careful there. I think somebody that it's all moving past me quite quickly. It was a UK, so it was ICF UK. So that might help you to find them. And it was an ICF UK series last year, and there were about 5 webinars. But somebody mentioned group trauma, massive topic. So I only looked at individual trauma, but a couple of names in that space, and I'm going to quickly look at my bookshelf. There was somebody called Hubel, Hubl, Thomas Hubel, who's written a book called Healing Collective Trauma. So that's a big one in the collective trauma space. Just having another quick look down my bookcase. See if there's anything else particularly beneficial. I mean, yeah, there are a huge number of books in this area now. The work of Gabor Mate is relevant, and another sort of bestseller alongside Bessel van der Kolk's work. And there's some interesting work. A lot of people are talking about polyvagal theory. So again, a sort of somatic work around how trauma might come up for people, but again, really needing to be careful here that it's around that we're focusing on coaching. We might observe certain things in people, but the degree to which we're not stepping over that line into therapy, I think it's sometimes these things are very useful to increase our awareness. And particularly, I think Nadia said she was a supervisor, so obviously, but just being careful that if a lot of our learning here comes from the therapy world, but using it to inform us rather than thinking that our coaching going in the direction of therapy itself. I hope that answers the question.
That is such a massive area. It's another few
Huge.
hours.
It's absolutely huge, but there are some interesting. There's a paper which again I can't remember, but I might send you the name of Claire, that was around organizational trauma. So
Yeah.
I've got the because it's a paper, it's not on my shelf, so
Yeah.
I can't see it immediately. But yeah, one thing that did come up with the supervisors was some really interesting stuff around collective, intergenerational, all sorts of other sorts of trauma that happen more to groups rather than in it being about group dynamic more than individual. And you know, all awareness, it's key here, just increasing our own awareness and learning. I think Ali has his hand up. Go for it.
Yes, thank you. You can hear me, right?
I can
We
hear
can
you.
hear you.
Yeah. First of all, I want to thank you both, and especially Joanna, for this session. My question is, from your experience, which is a difficult trauma, whether it is the child one or in life or in work space? I think, did you get my question?
I think I did. What I would say is that I think what can come up, what's probably more well, no, that this is just my personal opinion. So this is not from the research. This is just a general sense I get, is that when it's the survival behaviors, so people maybe responding out of proportion to a situation, say in the workplace, that's more likely to be about a developmental trauma, so something from childhood where they've learned a coping mechanism because of something that was going on for a long period of time, maybe in their childhood. And so when you're seeing someone behaving in a disproportionate way, a reaction to a bully in the workplace, something like that, then that might be to do with that earlier life stuff. And so might be a bit more hidden. Whereas somebody who has something happen to them during your coaching, you know, a child dies or something dreadful happens, you know, to them personally, that's more likely to be sort of above visible. It's more likely to be something that they might bring specifically and have actually them to express that it's happened, versus maybe a behavior that could you might wonder whether it's to do with something in the past, but you never actually, again, we're not therapists, so you wouldn't necessarily say, well, you're behaving in this way, so that makes me think this something might have happened to you in childhood. You're not going to go there, but it's more just your awareness might be, oh, I wonder whether that might be about something else from the past. So that's kind of how the two, I think, might come up. I hope that's helpful. It's again a huge topic, Ali. Khaled?
Yes, hello. Yes, Khaled.
Hello.
First, as I would like to thank you very much for also your amazing session. And thank you, Dr. Kala. You always bring us for amazing session. About me, actually, I'm Khaled from Cairo, Egypt. Actually, I'm pro coach since 10 years ago, actually, and also multilingual facilitator by WPX. I would like to comment about the Ali question because I'm actually working in education. Actually, why I'm coaching, a coaching background of my career as a teacher. Okay, I teacher in international school, and I see that I have to learn more about coaching to be able to become qualified teacher. As a teacher, I contact with parents and students and administration, and there are this a big people, you know, that's crowded people you have to support. You have to be ready for support for good behavior. I see by myself as I'm a coach and a teacher, I did support for my children in school. Let me share some accident happened with me in my class with my students in grade 9. This guy, he from Netherlands, and he did trouble all time with his friends. Incredible! You cannot believe this guy sit in international school. I invited him before to come to me in my class, in my office, to talk about what he did actually. He said to me, I'm from Netherlands, his mother from Netherlands, and his father from Egypt. Why he hate the school? Because this guy, he talk with his mother in Dutch, and he talks with his father in Arabic. And he said in international school, we have to talk English because English, it's standard languages in all school. And this guy, he hid the rules of this. He cannot be compatible with his friends. That's the big trouble. I promised him to talk with him what he like. I'm lucky because I can talk 9 languages. I asked this guy, what you like to talk here in school? He said to me, I prefer to talk Dutch. I promised him at this moment, I support him to talk Dutch and learn in Dutch languages. And was talk with my general director. You know, actually after few months, this guy, he changed it, his behavior, he become really lovely boy. And his mother, when he came in the parents meeting, she was with me in the meeting, and she asked me, I so appreciate you, Mr. Khalid, because you did different with my son. What you did actually, please, can you teach me how I can support my child? That's the coaching. I told her, please, lady, you care for your son. So your son need continues with his life because he has a special period. You have your area. You have to support him. What what he love, not for what you love. No, what he love, because that's the time for him. Thank you. That's why I would like to share that because that's very important. And thank you, Julia, for your topics. It's really amazing. Thank you.
My pleasure. And I think that's a classic example of being client-led and client-centered in a slightly different setting. But yes, I think you're meeting your client where they are and being sensitive to what they're experiencing. So I think that's a great illustration of that. I think have we reached the end of the questions there, Claire?
We've reached the end of the questions, and I think with following you also on LinkedIn, we'll put a post on our channel. This topic can continue together, and it's the type of topic where, as you say, it's in its infancy in terms of research, and so we can all continue to learn together.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. I've really enjoyed it, and good luck on your coaching journeys.
Thank you. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Pleasure. Iman, I think you joined late. Maybe you joined, but we've got it recorded.
I joined late because between the comparison between your countries, that's